Dogpiled by Compile, it's NES Works episode 65. Star Force on NES isn't much to write home about, but the game does hold the special distinction of launching a completely different legacy of video games. This is the NES conversion of a minor hit by Tekken, the company now known as Tecmo, or I guess as half of Koei Tecmo. It's the fourth Tecmo arcade port we've seen on NES in 1987, though this one falls more in line with Solomon's Key than it does with Mighty Bomb Jack or RYGAR. That is to say, it's a fairly direct port that doesn't take a particularly adventurous approach to the adaptation process. While Mighty Bomb Jack added an esoteric puzzle element and restructured its level designs for NES, and RYGAR completely reinvented itself as an exploratory platformer with Zelda-style connective scenes, Star Force is pretty much just a visually downgraded version of the arcade game, at least so far as I can tell. The two big changes Star Force brings to the table over the arcade original is its shift from vertical screen orientation to a horizontal screen, an inevitable change for an NES game, and its stripped-down color palette. The original Star Force wasn't exactly the most vivid game around, but its use of color was fairly varied. On NES, though, it takes, shall we say, a reductive approach. Backgrounds are typically neutrals and earth tones, grays and browns, with small bits of blue or gray for destructible targets, while enemies are always orange. This makes what was already a repetitive and monotonous game feel even more so, but it's still a defensible change, as it helps the action read a little more easily. The game doesn't look exciting, but you never have to worry about hazards getting lost in the backgrounds and killing you without being seen. It's a simple-looking game, and its gameplay is every bit as basic. But that's to be expected. Star Force debuted on Famicom in Japan back in June 1985. That's half a year before 1942 reached Famicom, and more than a year before ZANAC or Alpha Mission arrived. In the US, Star Force had the poor fortune to show up at almost exactly the same time as ZANAC, a game that demolishes it in every possible way. In Japan, though, it was a pretty early release, and at the time before advanced mapper chips and more seasoned programming, it was a pretty impressive technical showcase for the system, and it became a pretty big breakout hit. That success can be credited to Hudson, who had licensed the game from Tekken or Tecmo for home release. Hudson was, of course, one of Nintendo's earliest third-party Famicom partners, as noted in the Lode Runner episode. And in 1985, they had a better grasp on the console's capabilities than any other external publisher besides HAL. Hudson was so taken by Star Force's success, in fact, that they couldn't quite bring themselves to give up the property. They mutated it into a very similar but legally distinct series called Star Soldier that would appear on NES before eventually becoming a mainstay of the TurboGrafx 16 library. There's a long-standing tradition of game publishers co-opting a developer's work to become their own. It's what gave us Ms. Pac-Man, the single greatest entry in Namco's Pac-Man franchise, and that was a game commissioned by American Pac-Man distributor Midway based on a Pac-Man hack by General Computing Corporation. Namco has barely acknowledged it for much of the game's existence. And just like Ms. Pac-Man outshining her paramour, Star Soldier would eclipse the popularity of Star Force. It became a mainstay of Hudson's Caravan events, a series of touring competitions across Japan in which contestants vied for high scores throughout the late 80s and early 90s. Star Force, and later Star Soldier, also became the basis of an entire career for a man named Toshiyuki Takahashi. Thanks to his extraordinary dexterity, which allowed him to press the fire button up to 16 times per second, he soon became known as Master Takahashi, a literal mascot for Hudson. He starred in the game Adventure Island, which we'll eventually see here on NES Works. As for Star Force's original creators at Tekken, or rather Tecmo, well, they created a handful of Star Force sequels that went nowhere. And honestly, it's not that hard to see why. Star Force impressed back in 1985, but there's not actually that much of a game there. Certainly not enough to hang a franchise on. As an Alpha mission, you fly vertically, shoot both aerial and land-based targets, and deal with alphanumeric icons. Unlike an Alpha mission, the alphanumeric targets don't really seem to do anything. There is only one power-up in the entire game, a small fighter add-on that doubles your ship's size, speed, and rate of fire. That's it. The game consists of 24 stages, each with a boss named after a letter of the Greek alphabet. Each stage is pretty much the same, and so is each boss. There is hardly any variety here, with one exception: enemy patterns. From what I can tell, enemy formations appear in a fixed sequence beginning at the start of the game. While you're sent back to the start of the current stage anytime you die, enemy patterns don't reset when that happens. So every time you die and resume progress, you'll face a completely different sequence of foes than you did in your first attempt, as the enemy patterns continue to build on what's come before. Compare that to something like GRADIUS or 1942, where enemies appear in fixed patterns based on your location in a stage. The lack of any real relationship between enemy formations and stage progression in Star Force makes for a more fluid and unpredictable game. And good God, is it difficult. It's easy to see how Star Force helped launch a series of competitions because it's insanely hard. Making any progress at all here is something worth being proud of. Enemies appear in massive numbers, fire off constant waves of projectiles, and are generally fast and difficult to predict, not to mention erratic. The further you venture into the game, the more ruthlessly unfair their patterns and behavior become. It's pretty impressive technically, and I can see how kids in 1985 would get hooked on it. But we're looking at the end of 1987 now, baby, and there is no reason to play Star Force when ZANAC is already out there. It turns out overshadowed by compile is the prevailing theme of this episode, because Side Pocket here suffers the same fate. But then this is a Data East game. Coming in as second best seems to have been that company's entire approach to NES publishing. For instance, Tag Team Wrestling wasn't a patch on Nintendo's Pro Wrestling. Ring King couldn't even clear the weigh-in versus Punch-Out. And soon we'll be seeing Breakthrough, which is a paltry shadow of Konami's Jackal. Data East just can't get a break. And, as if to prove it, here's Side Pocket. Now, Side Pocket is a perfectly tolerable game, a billiard sim with a decent enough physics model. We've already looked at Side Pocket on Game Boy Works, and the two versions of the game are fundamentally the same thing. NES Side Pocket enjoys some minor advantages in terms of graphical resolution for more precise shooting, and the presence of color to make it easier to distinguish the different balls from one another. Otherwise though, this is exactly what we saw on Game Boy. The game's main mode consists of a string of challenges to earn a set number of points and advance all the way through the ranks within a set number of shots. The basic table is manageable, but the score requirements climb rapidly with each new table, and your shot allowance does not fully regenerate between tables. By the time you reach the third rank, you basically need to be able to sink every ball in order without missing a shot, and to pull off an extravagant trick shot in the process. It's not impossible, probably, but it's extremely challenging. To its credit, Side Pocket does offer a lot of control over your shot. You can hit high or low on the cue ball to affect how it behaves after striking its target, or you can force it to veer right or left. You can fine-tune the angle at which you hit the ball, and use a golf-style meter to affect the force of your shot. It's all well and good, but honestly Side Pocket seems incredibly dull after LUNAR Pool. Here you always have the same table layout and one of a handful of ball setups, and the friction of the table is always the same. Compare that to LUNAR Pool's 60 tables and hundreds of degrees of variable friction, and, well, I guess there's something to be said for the authentic pool experience, but as video game experiences go, give me LUNAR Pool any day. Next time on NES Works, can Data East redeem itself by getting radical?